Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves. I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here on Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are so delighted to have you folks here both live and virtually as we celebrate the Winnipeg launch, or Winnipeg evening, with Thomas Wharton, the author of the magisterial new book, The Book of Rain, a fact which you may applaud. We've been looking forward to this evening for a very long time. This book has made the rounds here in the store on multiple occasions, and everybody has fallen in love with it. So we're particularly thrilled to hear what Thomas has to say. We're so pleased that co-owner Chris Hall from the store is actually the person conducting the interview. So this is a purely in-the-house evening, and we're very excited about that. I won't take up too much of your time. I just wanted to quickly go over some housekeeping notes as to how the evening will progress. So there'll be a reading from Thomas just to my left. That'll be followed by a conversation between himself and Chris. After that, there'll be the opportunity for you folks to ask questions if anything pops up in your head. If that is the case, please just raise your hand and I'll run over to you, Donahue style, with this microphone, which is not a comment on your ability to project your voice, but just ensures that we can hear the questions. If you're one of those folks watching at home, please feel free to just write any questions you might have in the chat and we'll put them to our author as time permits. There have been, that is right, I will not be returning at the end of the event. Instead, you'll be hearing a few words from our partner on this event, the Winnipeg International Writers Festival, who will manifest in the form of Charlene Beale, their director. So the only thing I will put in your brain right now is that just at the close of the event, we'd ask you all just to remain in your seats for one moment as we safely transport Thomas over to a table just beside our cash desk where he'll be happy to sign books for you. And Charlene will tell you a little bit more about our partnership at the end. We're always thrilled whenever we have an opportunity to team up with them. We're also very grateful to Penguin Random House of Canada, and particularly the Random House of Canada arm of that conglomeration, for helping to make this evening a possibility, and of course for publishing this book in the first place. Now, I will not take up much more of your time, instead I will just tell you about the two folks who will be speaking here tonight. Host Chris Hall, my far left, has been with McNally Robinson for more than 25 years, more than 10 of which as owner. When he isn't reading or walking, he loves to travel and cook. He lives in Winnipeg and is currently training his daughters to be booksellers. Our featured author tonight, Thomas Wharton, his first novel was Ice Fields, which is a book that I still have a very vivid sensory memory of reading, one of those rare books that just kind of genuinely transports you when you open its pages. That book also received the Banff Mountain Book Festival Grand Prize, the Writers Guild of Alberta First Book Award, and a Regional Commonwealth Writers Prize for Best First Book. He now lives and teaches English in Edmonton, where he is at work on his next novel, set in the present day. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Wharton.
Thanks, John. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. You guys are so lucky you have this store here. This is an amazing place. And, yeah, absolutely. This is fantastic. And I spent the day, I got here last night and I spent the day wandering around Winnipeg, and I came here once, something like 20 years ago. And this time around, I did a little bit more wandering than I did on that occasion. And yeah, I was just struck by, the history here and the beauty of the place. I went down to the Forks and I crossed the river into St. Boniface, and I saw Riel's grave site. And I know this is going to sound corny as hell, but I was just like, I feel like I'm in the absolute heart of Canada here, And it was kind of a really amazing feeling. And he's actually buried there. Is that right? Yeah, okay. Because it just doesn't look like it's enough of a, it should be something more. Anyways, And I'd also like to acknowledge that a former student of mine, Matt Tetro, is here this evening, and he had a launch of his novel, Hold Your Tongue, last night, which I think went really, really well. I deeply encourage you to get that book. It's not all set in Winnipeg, but very close to it. And it's a beautiful history and story of the Métis people and their language, which I feel very honored to have been part of along the way, as the process of being Matt's supervisor during his MA and all that kind of thing. And yeah, it's well worth having a look at for sure. So I think I will, and I also wanted to say thank you to the Winnipeg Writers Festival as well for having me here too. Okay, so this book is kind of difficult there's no elevator pitch for it. People have asked me, what is your book about? And I'm just like, well, and also, so it's kind of a tough one to describe, but I guess at the core of the story is a story of a family that moves to a small town in northern Alberta, which is kind of what happened to me when I was, I guess I was 15 when we moved from Grand Prairie to Jasper, which is kind of a different direction from when my character moved and his family moved in the book, but it's a similar sort of disruption. Anyways, they moved to this resource town, this mining town, and it's fictional. It's called River Meadows. But if you're reading this book and you think that you feel like there are parallels with Fort McMurray and the oil sands, well, that's not, that's not coincidence. I was originally, when I first set out to write this book, I was going to write about Fort McMurray and the mining of bitumen. But then I realized, well, that's not really my story. I've never lived there. I've never worked there. I know lots of people who have worked there, and they've told me all kinds of stories. But I thought, no. And what I ended up doing is what I usually end up doing. I start off with something realistic, and by the time I'm done with it, I've turned it fantastical. So that's what I did with this book. It tells the story of this town, this fictional town called River Meadows, where they're mining this ore, which is called Ghost. And it has these weird properties that affect people and cause hallucinations and weird kind of skips of time and space and so on. So that's kind of at the heart of what this book is about. And I think I'll just read a couple of sections about the family. And this one is about the father, Ben. The two main characters are Alex, the teenage boy, and his little sister, Amory. But Ben, their father, gets a job driving one of these huge trucks that hauls the ore up out of these pits. Ben operates one of the mammoth trucks that haul the raw ore out of the excavation pits. They're removing the boreal forest in neat rectangular chunks like date squares from a pan, peeling away a soggy carpet of muskeg to scoop out what has been steeping here for 100 million years, the sour black honey of time. There's a coker plant on the site, which Ben thinks is funny. This whole place is a coker plant. One of the guys Ben gets to know had been a crack addict who cleaned himself up after his friends staged an intervention. They broke all of his crack pipes and beat the shit out of him. When he tells Ben the story, he adds, "And when I got out of the hospital, I thanked them for it, and we're still friends. Those guys saved my life." Only 2 women work at the excavation sites. Every guy on the shift knows exactly where these women are at all times. Most of this attention is your typical slack-jawed scoping of the ladies, but in a few cases, the surveillance is clearly hostile. Some men do not want women in their domain. Everything about the operation is orderly, methodical, streamlined, if you don't count some of the yahoos working the machines. The marathon shifts they pull have some of the younger crew on a slow smolder all the time, as if the toxic fuel they're clawing out of the earth has leached into their veins and started combusting. Ben is in the truck cab one afternoon, climbing up out of the pit with a load of ore when the hammering starts. At first, he thinks it's coming from somewhere on the other side of the shatterproof windows, but it's his heart banging to get out. He manages to brake just before something huge pins him to the seat so he can't move or breathe. A dark planet has rolled over the earth and is crushing the air and the light out of him, out of everything. He's pretty much gone, except for one thought: the kids. He sees them as they were when they were little, and after a while notices his hand moving the way it did when he stroked their hair, after one of them had woken up after a bad dream. That's what gets him through. When it passes, whatever it was, he can finally answer the voice freaking out on the radio. He makes up a story about the instrument panel going wacky, warning lights blinking like a Christmas tree. They garage the truck and run it through every test in the book. They don't find a thing, of course. Wrong piece of equipment hooked up to the monitor. It wasn't a decoherence, he knows that much for certain. These strange ripples that warp time and space and cause hallucinations. People call them decoherences. They also call them wobbles. So it wasn't a decoherence, he knows that much for certain. It hadn't felt like one of those at all. And anyway, the wobbles never happened at the excavation sites. Whatever it was, where did it come from, he wonders, and why had it sucker punched him now? Things are good. His job is paying the bills, and then some. A lot of, and then some. Beth has that part-time position at the town office. There's no question about what they're working their butts off for, or who. He's a father. There really isn't anything better a man can be, is there? The next morning, he drives to the site and parks, but instead of heading straight in as usual, he takes a stroll around the perimeter of the lot. His hands are shaking, his walk all jerky and wrong like a marionette's. At the far end, nearest the exit, a skinny guy leaning against a sky blue Camaro sees him coming his way and waves, as if he's been waiting for him. Ben has never met the guy, but he knows who he is by reputation. Some of the crew call this end of the parking lot the candy store. Easier than ordering a pizza. Hey, the guy says, I think I just saw a bear. A bear? The guy nods towards the trees at the edge of the gravel. They stand there all leafy and uninterested as if this is any other morning. In there, man, I mean a big bear. Maybe a grizzly, I don't know, it was right there. What's it doing, do you think? Ben asks, squinting and shielding his eyes with his hand. He's really straining to see that bear. He needs to see it. Taking a shit, probably, the guy says. That's what they do in the woods, right? Ben laughs, but it comes out sounding like he's jogging downhill. The guy's eyes widen. Whoa, that kind of day, huh? Yeah, that kind, says Ben. Are you Jared Sawchuk? None other. Okay, Ben says. Okay, indeed, Jared Sawchuk says. What'll it be? Ben looks at the Camaro, then at the trees. He raises a hand. You know what? Forget it. I'm good. Well, I would say not. Ben heads for the gate. In the staging compound, he finds Dylan Chaudier, the shift foreman, and tells him he must have come down with a stomach flu or something. Dylan looks at his chalky, sweating face and backs away, ordering him the fuck home. And I'll just read one last section, which is about Alex and his little sister Amory. She's the one who's been the most affected by these decoherences. And they changed her a lot, and she spends a lot of time wandering around by herself in the forest outside the town. And Alex is supposed to look after her, but being a teenage boy, he's like, this isn't my problem, right? And Alex, like me, when I was a kid, spends a lot of his time creating his own comic books. Alex is in his room that afternoon working on his new Kid Quantum comic book when Amory appears in the doorway. He's surprised. She's been gone for hours, Whatever it is, wherever it is she goes these days. Usually she returns from one of her forays without anyone noticing. They just suddenly find her there in her room or wherever, as if she never left. She stands there not saying anything. What is it? There's something I need you to come see. Come see what? I'll show you, it's in the woods. Of course it's in the woods. I need your help, please. 30 minutes later, they've reached the bank of the creek. They can hear River Meadows behind them, the soft, distant murmur of a working town. This is in late May, but it's been a dry spring and the water in the creek bed is little more than a trickle. They cross on the little 3-log bridge that someone built there, maybe a long time ago. On the far side, they walk through a stand of poplars and come out into a long, straight, open area, like a cut line, only narrower than the ones Alex saw when Ben tried to get him interested in snowshoeing one winter. Where are we going? He asks his sister for at least the 4th time. She hasn't told him anything. They walk for another few minutes until they meet near a huge pine that has fallen into the path. Its branches are still thick with needles, but they're brown. Amory comes to a stop. Alex looks around. You brought me out here to look at a dead tree. No, she whispers, pointing at the pine. There. Look there. He squints. Half concealed in the tangle of shadows beneath the branches, there's an animal. Alex is so startled he nearly jumps back. It's a small dog, he thinks at first. Then he notices the patchy, dark rust shade of the fur, the pointed, black-tipped ears and sharp snout, and realizes this must be a fox. It's tensed, heeled forward, as if it had frozen in place while darting into a run. The wind is catching and flicking stray tufts of its fur. The pale amber gems of its eyes are fixed straight ahead. A feeling like a frenzy of ants crawls across the back of Alex's neck. You never see wild animals just stand there like this when people are around. As soon as they catch a sight of a human, they're gone. Something is very wrong here. It's stuck, Amory says. Her tone is matter of fact, simply stating how things are. She doesn't sound scared or upset or anything. What do you mean stuck? It's trapped. I don't see any trap. You can't see it, but it's there. He doesn't know what she's talking about. He searches the ground and finds a dead branch as long as his arm, slender enough that he can grip it easily, but with a good solid heft to it. Holding the stick at the ready, he dares another step forward, forward toward the fox, then another. This is some kind of trick. Did you do this? It's alive, Amory says. Look at its face. Alex edges closer. He can just make out a tremor along the fox's muzzle. After a further moment of careful observation, he sees the same almost imperceptible trembling in its forelegs. It looks like it's starving, Alex says. It must have been stuck here a long time. It's in pain, Amory says. It's really hurting. How do you know that? Its eyes. It's afraid of us, he said, that's all. It can't move for some reason and it's scared shitless. No, it's dying, Amory says, because it can't escape. Alex turns to her. That thing will bite us for sure if we go anywhere near it. It probably has rabies, and I don't want to get stuck like that. You won't, Amory says. How do you know? I got stuck here too. You what? The last time I came here, I went up to the tree and I felt something holding my arms and legs, something I couldn't see. I pulled really hard and I got away. I don't think the trap is strong enough to catch animals as big as us. We're not animals. Yes, we are. I'm not touching that thing, he says. We have to do something. Alex glances down at the stick in his hand. There's one thing, he says. Amory looks at the stick and back up at her brother. Don't do it, she says. I think I'll stop there.
Very good. Welcome to Winnipeg. Welcome to McNally Robinson.
Yeah.
You have been here before, you said, but you didn't know until you actually came
that's
in.
right. Yeah, it was like 20 years ago, and I wasn't sure I'd been in this store. Then John brought me over to this corner. I was like, oh yeah, deja vu.
Made an impression.
Yeah.
Good. So I read a couple of interviews with you to get prepared for this, and I was struck in one of them. You described great efforts you put into to get to know your characters and make sure you kind of know them inside and out. So I thought that's a good way to kind of get into the book, maybe starting with Alex. You kind of described him a little bit there. He comes into town and immediately the family experiences one of the wobbles. And he responds well, I mean, he's kind of a normal kid into comic books and he creates games, and he goes on into adulthood creating games, and he makes a link to, he's a game creator, and he links that back to his response to the wobble. Can you tell us what that's about, how he responds?
Sure, yeah. Well, I thought originally that Alex was going to be a writer because he's the character in the book who's most like me. I always try to find a character who I can kind of relate to find my way into a story. So Alex was definitely that character. But, you know, early on I thought, there's so many books in which a writer is the main character because that's who writers know. That's what writers know, right? So I thought, can I do something a little bit different with this? And yeah, I remembered when I was a kid that I used to make my own games. I used to make my own comic books. So I kind of went in that direction instead, because it's always felt to me like that was a trajectory I didn't go on, that I could have. I could have been, you know, I used to draw a lot and paint and make comics and all that sort of thing. And as I say, make games, but I never really went in that direction. So I decided, well, I'm going to let Alex go in that direction. And I think it was just, you know, it just became a way of talking about a creative response or an artistic response to trauma and you know, things that happen to one's family and so on, but just with a slightly different angle to it, right? So his way of kind of trying to control or deal with things is to make a game. And I think there's a lot of parallels to what writers do, right? Because I know that for me, part of the enjoyment of creating a novel is that I'm putting all of this together. I'm kind of in control of it. I can decide what's going to happen and where, and for whatever, you know, psychological reason, there's something very satisfying about that. And there is for Alex too in the making of a game. You know, games have rules. They don't work if they don't have rules, right? They have to have rules. And it's the kind of give and take between the rules and the creativity of the people playing the game that makes it interesting. So yeah, I just see a parallel to writing in that.
And then Amory, you read the passage there where she knows the fox is in pain. She has a little bit more of an intuitive response, if Alex is maybe more rational. Is that correct?
Yeah, she was a tough character to deal with because I thought, you know, that I was going to make her a much sort of bigger character in the book than I ended up doing. But I realized that there's, you know, she in a way is kind of, she's like some of my heroes in the environmental movement, you know, people like Jane Goodall or Diane Fossey or you know, David Suzuki, people like that, who are very idealistic, very driven, and see things they have a vision of the natural world, which, you know, most of us either don't understand or find it difficult to kind of to imagine, you know, what drives them and what motivates them. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to keep her as kind of more of a distant character. We're going to meet her through what she writes mostly, right? No, we're not going to spend a lot of time in her head. I don't think, you know, there's barely anything at all, if anything, that happens from her perspective. But, you know, she's obviously a very, very important character, but she's kind of like someone that the other characters don't understand because she is so driven and so idealistic.
It's funny that I thought she was a big character. Like her presence almost is everywhere in that book. The others are kind of literally there. She's not. It's almost like maybe the imagination does some of the work. But I thought she was a very large presence in the book. Interesting way, because she's not necessarily on stage all the time.
She ends up being, you know, she ends up kind of lasting longer than everybody else, if you want to put it that way in the story. Right? Yeah. She's there till the very end practically.
Yeah, that's true too. So there's a third character I wanted to talk about because she goes a completely different way. Claire. Claire is in the diner where the Hewitts first experienced the wobble. So she that wouldn't be her first. She lives there, but she has a completely different response to that. Tell us about Claire.
Sure. Yeah. Well, she's like so many people. She grows up in a small town, and she can't wait to get the hell out of there, right? So she represents something about that kind of aspect of growing up in a place like River Meadows or Grand Prairie or wherever. And you know, so she's got reasons for what she, or at least she thinks she's got good reasons for what she does. She traffics in illegal wildlife parts, and this is something that, you know, I've been aware of for many, many years. We have this kind of thing happen in Alberta, and I'm sure it happens here too, right? Selling bear gallbladders or whatever, right? So she gets into that as a way to escape, to make money and escape where she lives. And that again was something that kind of changed, because originally she was just somebody who left town, got the hell out of town, and became a journalist and a writer and traveled all over the world. But I was like, well, what makes this person interesting? I don't know yet. And then I thought, well, what if she's doing something illegal? And then all of a sudden, aha, right? Like now I'm interested in her because she's doing this thing which is wrong, but she's got good reasons for doing it, and she thinks she's right in doing it. And so her journey is one of kind of coming to see something that a character like Amory almost kind of naturally understands, but it takes Claire, some things that happen to her in the book, to kind of come in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then I want to turn to, maybe we could describe them as a collective character, the animals. The novel is full of anecdotes and interludes with animals, and mostly animals that are somehow suffering or otherwise affected by human presence. I mean, the animals get almost the first word, the epigraph, right? Nature see you, says Coco the gorilla.
Right.
So why did you want to fill the novel with wildlife?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to think that that epigraph that I chose from Coco the gorilla is the first book that has an epigraph by a non-human writer. But I'm not sure whether that's true, but I kind of like to think that. I don't know, this kind of goes way back to the beginning of where this thing all came from. Was I wanted to include non-human people in the story, right? Non-human persons in the story. And I tried to find different ways to do that. And the more I kind of looked into our effect on the natural world and animals, the more I realized that, well, what happens to animals in a human-dominated world? Mostly they suffer and die. It's kind of the downer part of the book, but it's so true. Whether you're talking about domestic animals or wild animals. And I just thought, okay, well, I'm just gonna let these stories into the novel and see what happens. And so there's a lot of interspersed stories about animals and encounters with humans and how they generally don't end well for the animals. And then when I got near the end of Alex's story, I just felt like, well, I haven't let them actually speak for themselves yet. So that's where the idea to end the book with this poem told by a bird to a human researcher came in, and I was just like, what am I doing? Okay, I'm going to end this book with an epic poem, and I did. And when I sent the manuscript to my editor, Ann Collins at Random House, I thought, this is probably the deal breaker. When she gets to that epic poem, oh dear. But she loved it. She thought, it did what the book needed to do at that point, kind of opened its scope out wider and kind of fulfilled some of the themes that come into it along the way. So it's just like, okay, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to talk about that later, but there's a whole language that the birds speak that humans are the only ones who don't understand. The animals eventually start to learn that language, the utterings, it's called.
Yeah.
And Amory talks to the animals, and humans think she's crazy, but actually she is learning how to speak to the animals. So you literally give them a voice, but it ends up being like that poem. starts to get back into, or deep into myth and like ancient times, and yet it's the future. It's an amazing way to finish the book.
Thanks.
But on a thematic level, giving the animals not quite the last word, but awfully close to the last word. It's
right.
I'm not sure comforting is the right word.
Yeah. Well, I like to think there's some hope in that part of the story. You know, after some of the grim things that happened in the earlier parts of the book, I wanted to end it with the idea that it might take terrible things to happen to our society and our civilization, but I think eventually human beings will come to realize that we're totally interdependent with everything else that lives, and that's nothing new, but we seem to just push it aside, that idea. But we will come to understand that we need to get closer, not to our screens and to AI, but closer to nature in order to figure out a way to live sustainably on the planet. So, that was part of the reason for telling that story. And, I liked the idea that why would animals come up with a language? Why would birds come up with a language that different species of birds can share? And when the idea occurred to me, well, they would do that as a way to deal with us, right? To survive us. They would need a language to help each other survive. And when I sort of came up with that idea, I thought, that makes sense. That's what it would be. So.
And it's in line with some of the research about trees.
Yeah.
The roots, they communicate with each other through their roots, and a big part of that is defense. So who are they defending themselves against?
Right. Yeah. No, the things that science has discovered recently about how trees communicate with each other, how animals communicate, the languages that even the tiniest creatures have for communicating with each other. There's a whole universe of things going on out there that we barely know anything about yet. And it's really kind of exciting and wonderful, I think, that we're on the edge of just understanding how intelligent and complicated and amazing nature is. Yeah.
I was reading a review of the book that kept calling it science fiction. And I have to say, I was struck. I hadn't thought of science fiction at all as I was reading it. I was thinking, it certainly picked up on the Fort McMurray oil parallel, but so I was thinking of it as almost as alternative in some way. It doesn't feel like that it's that far in the future. It seems like it could be an alternative present, maybe an alternative near future. But I was reading that you have a different term for it, a third possibility. Tell us about the science fable.
Oh yeah. Well, fables are a genre that started out being little, moralistic animal stories, right? And like Aesop's fables or the fables of I've forgotten the name, French writer. Thank you. Whoever said that, yeah. So there's a long history of that kind of thing, using animals in a story to say something about human qualities or whatever. And I thought, well, I kind of want to not flip that on its head, but I want the animals in this book to just represent themselves, right? They don't represent this quality or that quality of human beings or this moral idea or that. They're just animals. And yet at the same time, I'm still kind of using that fable idea that animals in a story acting kind of like people, But yeah, it's very much informed by science at the same time. That we were talking about earlier, what we read, right? The kind of books we read, and I was mentioning that I read a lot of science books, popularized science books for the general reader, because I'm finding more and more that's where really interesting metaphors pop up to me. They pop out at me. I'm thinking like it's an idea in science, but I'm thinking as a writer and a fiction writer, I can play with this idea and do something with it in fiction, and it's fiction, so it's okay. I can say that birds develop a language with each other, and no one's going to tell me that could never happen. Right? Maybe it never could, but because it's fiction, I can take that idea of animals having languages and just kind of play with it.
And I also understand that your approach to writing is
you described as being partly taking on like a jigsaw puzzle. And so that certainly made me think of Alex in this book, and also your previous novel, or Salamander, which is so full of puzzles and games. It's an amazing book. So how do puzzles and games relate to writing? How do or relate to storytelling?
Well, yeah, when I started out as a writer, one of my teachers was Rudy Wee, the great prairie writer. And, you know, Rudy was a very sort of, is a very sort of, you know, kind of commanding presence, very, you know, authoritative about writing. And he used to, you know, tell us, it's simple to write a story, right? Start at the beginning, work your way through and come to the end. And so I kind of got the idea, well, that's what I've got to do. I've got to start at the beginning and go through to the end. But I could never make it work for me because, you know, I had all sorts of great beginnings, right? And then I get to a certain point and I'm like, well, okay, I guess I need an outline now because I have no idea where this is going to go. So I would write an outline. And once I had the outline, I was like, oh, well, now I'm bored. I know where the story is going. This is boring. I don't want to write this. So I just, at a certain point, I realized I have to find a different way, and a way that works for me. And one of my other writing teachers, Christiana Gunnars, I brought all this material that I had. It was just a mess of stuff. I had no idea what I was going to do with it. And I brought it to her. She was my MA thesis supervisor. And I said, I've got all these fragments. I don't know what to do with them. And her reaction was, fragments are wonderful. You can do all kinds of amazing things with fragments. And it was just a kind of moment of, oh, really? So that was when that whole idea of treating a book like a jigsaw puzzle kind of came into being. And I realized this was what was going to work for me, right, as a writer, was bits and pieces, and then to find what connects them, right, put them together. But unlike a jigsaw puzzle, it's not like there was a picture on the box to tell me what the finished thing was going to look like. It was just puzzle pieces with no finished picture, and I had to create the picture as I went along.
I wanted to go back to your first novel, Icefields, as John was mentioning earlier, another very good book, highly recommended. And it's about Jasper National Park, more or less, back in the 1800s, as white people were first discovering it, first hanging around. And you have a character in it, Edward Byrne, who was fascinated by the glaciers, and it's a real science. I don't think he's a scientist officially.
No, he's a doctor. Yeah.
Right, so he's a hobbyist essentially,
Yeah.
but a very rational man who likes to keep records, but he discovers the glaciers are always changing and always shifting. And so he has, that starts to throw him a little off, but then he also falls in a crevice and he thinks he sees an angel. So what is it? What are you doing when you're introducing such an irrational or something that doesn't fit his rational world into such a rational character?
Yeah, well, I guess it's kind of what happens to me when I go to a place like the Icefields, the Columbia Icefields, is, you know, I spend most of my time, like most of us do, in a very rational world where everything kind of is logical and makes sense, and we do the things we need to do to get through life. But for me, a place like the Icefields is, well, it really is a spiritual kind of place, because it just makes me realize that there's a world that's so much bigger that I don't fully understand, that was not created by me, you know, or any one human. It's much far, 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 far older, and we came to be in this larger space, and it just creates wonder in me and awe, and you call it irrational, I guess, but I'll go back to that word spiritual. That's the only thing that's the only kind of spiritual experience I've ever had, is in nature. And maybe that's kind of a cliche, but it's definitely true. And so again, it's a character, I start with a character who's kind of like me, you know, he was this very sort of logical, rational guy, and then he confronts something that he doesn't fully understand, and it just, you know, takes him off the track of what he thought his life was going to be. And that's kind of what happened to me moving to Jasper with my family when I was a teenager.
I want to pick up on that unfamiliarity, because the word that I kept using was uncertainty. This
Mhm.
book has such uncertainty in it, and it seems to me to be where so much of its power is. And I think of the way you write in fragments, and then that implies that there's space that gets removed. Like you can't stitch fragments together absolutely, so there's nothing left in between. And I think of poetry where the white space on the page is, you have to pay attention to it, and reading between the lines is about the white space and the gap between books. And so the uncertainty that the angel presents to Edward Byrne and in Salamander is such a weaving and roaming story, but then there's such a yearning to contain stories in books and contain people in prisons and under strict rules. So there's this tension that I noticed in all three books that I read with that. And then of course, Alex faces that uncertainty and he wants to create rules in the games, and that gives him some comfort. And another character we haven't talked about, Michio. He's a scientist, Amory's friend, and he searches for answers, obviously, trying to figure out what's going on with these wobbles. And then there's another group that becomes very certain of themselves, in the Church of Conjuration. How does their style of religion try to fill in those gaps and create certainty?
Yeah, because this book is kind of based on Fort McMurray and the oil sands and all that kind of thing, I wanted to bring in some of the real world conflicts that swirl around resource extraction and so on. And you know, I don't think Fort McMurray has a church of the bitumen or anything like that, but as far as I know. Yeah, you know, that's a really interesting angle that you're talking about, that idea of certainty and uncertainty. I've just been reading Carlo Rovelli's, one of his newest books, the one about the Greek philosopher Anaximander. And Carlo Rovelli, a physicist, talks about science isn't about truth and nailing things down. It's about uncertainty, right? Science works because it keeps overturning the idea that there's a certainty and looking further and going further. And when I read that, I thought, yeah, that's kind of what's going on here in the novel, or maybe all of my novels to some extent, right? Is this conflict or this tension between this is the way things are, absolutely, no question, and characters who push against that. And I'm not even sure I was entirely aware of that until I was reading this in Rovelli's book, and then, of course, your question too. So, yeah.
There are places in this world where kindness is more important than rules.
Yeah.
That's a book by Carlo Rovelli.
Yeah.
I share an interest in Carlo Rovelli. But Daniel has a counter argument to science. He says that Daniel, is one of the members of this church, and he says that science is simply an attempt to reduce the number to world, or to the world to numbers, and that feels like it has a kernel of merit to it. But you have Michio earlier in the novel saying that numbers open the world on a universe of wonder and fantastical strangeness, and it's thanks to numbers we know that reality at heart is nothing but fluctuating, vibrating fields of energy. So is that at the heart of the difference? The numbers in science aren't about pinning down knowledge, but about exploration and accepting the constancy of change?
Yeah, I think that gets kind of to the heart of that disagreement between these two characters, right? I don't disagree with everything Daniel says in a weird kind of way, right?
Yeah.
Like he says that there's something more to this universe, this world, than just what science can pin down, right? And turn into numbers. I don't disagree with that, but at the same time, I think if you take that yearning or that idea that there's something more and you turn it into something absolute, then you're really taking something that's really just a kind of metaphor for something you don't fully understand and can't completely comprehend, and reducing it down to dogma, right? And I think this is gone back through the history of human thinking and so on, this idea that, well, we've got to come up with ideas, metaphors, stories for the what we find around us in the world, and that's great. But at a certain point, somebody says, okay, well, I'm going to take the story and I'm going to make it the absolute truth. nothing else is true except this story that I've nailed down from this metaphor, this image. And that's where I think we kind of gone wrong as a species.
Well, yeah, you can use that certainty and to strike out at people because you just become unbending. It becomes almost this solid thing that
Right.
you use to hurt people.
And I live in Alberta, and let me tell you, things are,
I didn't want
things
to
are, yeah. So we have that kind of clash happening a lot.
But then there's another kind of religion represented in the book too, in the figure of Arahant. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. He's the leader of the religion that's on the island that Claire visits, and he has a moment with her, and you say his religion is described as having influences of Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. So is that really is there a difference, or is it on the surface, or he certainly strikes me as different from Daniel, for example, the other church.
Yeah, I think I wanted to have, I wanted to contrast Daniel's view of things with a spirituality that was more kind of open-minded. And, for, I think 15 years now, I've practiced Buddhist meditation. And there's a lot of things about Buddhism that appeal to me very much. One is, of course, the idea that of interdependence. We aren't just beings, we're interbeings with everything else that is. A human being is a collection of cells, each one of which is kind of its own, individual in a way. And also we have as many bacterial cells within us as we do our own cells, right? So what does that make a human being? It's bizarre to think about. But Buddhism, I think, intuited that in a way that other maybe Western religions didn't. And so it has a different kind of look at kind of what it means to be alive and exist.
I thought the word humility came to mind when he was in the book, because Claire pushes back a bit, and I don't want to give too much of the story away, but she pushes, and the rest of the residents think that she has to abide by the rules, and that they get this figurehead or this head of this religion to come, and he's going to finalize that rule, but he doesn't. He goes quite a different way, where he accepts that she's part of the story, and it seems to me like there's a humility there. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I guess so. I think I wasn't sure how that encounter between them was going to work out. What was going to happen with the two of them? I thought, okay, I've got this person who traffics in illegal wildlife parts. I've got this religious figurehead who's coming to talk to her about what she's doing. What's going to happen, right? I didn't know any more than the reader does at a certain point. So again, it's that jigsaw puzzle thing. And so I put these two things together, and it just seemed to click that they would find, an understanding with each other that I didn't even anticipate was going to happen. And so to me, that's as both a writer and a reader, it's one of those moments that I just cherish, where it's like, yeah, this feels right, but I didn't see it coming. It's both at the same time. I didn't see it coming, but yeah, this is great. The way the story takes a shift.
One of the interviews that I read is in the end of Ice Fields. Ice Fields is newly released, and so I was reading that. That's part of where I got to know more about you. And you comment in there, you read that book for the first time in 20 plus years or something, and it was an experience, kind of like you're describing, where you go back and you felt your way to something, and now you're seeing it from a completely different way. How strange was that?
Yeah, that was a wonderful opportunity to, New West Press in Edmonton re-released Ice Fields, which was my first novel, which was published in 1995, and they just released it in 2021 in a new edition, in which I did an interview with Smaro Cambarelli. And so in order to prepare for that new edition, I had to read the book again for the first time in 20 years, 25 years, something like that. And that was, my first thought was, geez, the guy who wrote this is so obsessed with glaciers. Right? What the hell? But that happens to me with every book I write. I have to get obsessed with something, and then I can then the energy arrives to write the damn thing, right? And in the case of ice fields, it was just glaciers. Like glaciers, like what are these things? This is incredible. How they work, what they are, or the history of them. And the same thing with this new book. It's like animals, birds. Oh my God, they're miraculous. And I just want to learn everything I can.
And you also mentioned the glaciers. Now we know they're slowly vanishing, let alone changing and shifting the way you were writing at the time.
Yeah, and when I wrote that book, I thought, okay, someday, 100 years from now, this might be a problem. And it's like, it's a problem now.
Seems too soon.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn to the audience to see if they have any questions. John, do you have that microphone? Oh.
Yes. I say as I very gently make my way out. I'm going to turn down this wireless microphone after kicking the soundboard. And does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Hi, I wanted to ask about your influences. It's tough because readers will pull out, oh, he must have been influenced by this, he must have been influenced by that. But I detected some notes of like Stalker, the Tarkovsky film. But the author always has different inspirations. So I just thought maybe I'd ask about that and see what you have to say.
Yeah, well, you're right about Stalker for sure. The Andrei Tarkovsky film, which I think was made in 1979, something like that. Yeah, just a few years before Chernobyl. And this is based on a science fiction novel, Roadside Picnic, by the Strugatsky brothers. And it takes place in a zone which has been sealed off and forbidden because something weird has happened there. Maybe aliens visited this place. The sort of conceit, I think, of the novel is that aliens came there, landed, had a picnic, and flew off, leaving their junk, their garbage behind, right? And so their garbage is like dangerous, bizarre, weird stuff that humans don't understand. So that's what makes this place sealed off, and people go in there and they search through all this stuff looking for things they can use or whatever. So I didn't read the book until I think I was already working on this novel, but I did see the film, and it's probably my favorite film of all time.
So I was right to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's 3 hours plus, and almost nothing happens. But you gotta see this film. It's amazing. Like, the characters just basically talk to each other as they're making their way through this forbidden zone, and it's just trees, flowers, birds, and some ruined buildings. And the Stalker character is a guy who takes people there. He's a guide. He knows where the dangerous things are to avoid. Anyhow, I could go on and on about that film. I think you should definitely watch it. But that's a major. I knew I wanted my characters to do something similar. Yeah. That and 1,000 other books. Yeah.
Were there any other questions?
I know your first endorsement refers to, your first blurb refers to the book as climate fiction. Are you entirely comfortable with that term? Do you use it for your own work?
I think it intersects with that. When I work on a book, I don't think about genre. I hardly think about genre at all. Because again, my method is just like, I'm going to be surprised by this. I don't know quite where it's going to go. And if I find myself using, things like this mysterious ore that causes strange hallucinations and so on, and I think, okay, that's kind of science fiction. Well, fine, it's science fiction. And the same thing with the climate fiction, subgenre, or whatever you want to call it. There was no way this book, if it was going to talk about animals and the fate of animals in a human-dominated world, and if it was going to talk about something kind of like the oil sands, there's no way to avoid climate as part of that, right? I'm not sure if this ended up in the finished book, but there was supposed to be a character who said something about how everything is about the weather now, right? Is that still in there? I can't remember. Anyways, okay, maybe that got cut, but I can't remember. But yeah, you know, it's kind of unavoidable.
And were there any other questions?
I have one more.
Absolutely.
I've had some of the best recommendations for books come from authors I admire. So do you have any recommendations, authors or books that you recommend?
Yeah, well, lots, probably
Thousands.
more than we can fit in. I've already talked about Matt's book. Please go and buy that one. Yeah, like I said, I read a lot of science books. I read a book recently by a German biologist, Andreas Weber, W-E-B-E-R, called The Biology of Wonder. And I read it after I wrote this, but it kind of confirmed some of what I was groping towards as a writer, a way of looking at other species as having their own subjectivity and their own way of being in the world. And that biology, by ignoring all of that, has it's done incredible things, but it's limited itself to a paradigm which sees other creatures as just sort of being part of the environment, right? And not really having their own selfhood and their own subjectivity. And yeah, it kind of blew me away to read that. So Biology of Wonder, for sure. Yeah. I don't know, there's
Carlo Rovelli.
Carlo Rovelli.
I'll second
Yeah,
that. Carlo
absolutely.
Rovelli.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What a conversation. That was just so special to be able to listen to readers and writers talk about speculation, I think. When I was thinking about this last title, The Science of Wonder, is that what you call it? I was thinking about how much of the conversation today and how much of the piece that you read is sort of about wondering. You know, it's like sort of wondering, a little bit what if, but sort of also like what is, like what are we in now? So thank you for that. So just so exciting to have that kind of invitation into our own kind of speculating. Thank all of you for coming to this amazing place. As you have already been informed, if you don't know me already, my name is Charlene Deal, and we're co-partners with McNally Robinson for this spring series, and really so happy to be part of it. And one of the great things that I get to do is earnestly and excitedly say how wonderful it is to be here in this space at this amazing, amazing place. We got to hear how special Chris is, and we all know that, you know, the Wizard of Oz here keeps jumping out and making things happen time after time. So can we just take a pause to give a big round of applause to McNally for being such an important part of our community. And how about one more really vigorous, noisy applause for Thomas and Chris for this really beautiful evening here. So we do a spring series over here, and we still have 2 more events left, and I had to get my calendar out because I don't know about you, but like we're almost at June, which seems hard to believe, although the weather feels more like July a bit today. June 3rd, we're welcoming Camille Hernandez-Ramdoir here with her book launch, and on June 15th, Sharon Batalla will be here. So I hope you'll come back for those 2. And now the last step of this evening is that Thomas is going to sign books over beside the desk over there. And you're welcome to get your book signed before you buy it, but you can't leave the store before you pay for it. I think they do it like that here. But I would encourage you to pause there and have a chance to talk to him about this book and to take a copy home for, you know, your reading for further speculation. And the request is that you just kind of stay put until he makes his way over to the desk. Sometimes I think the reason for this is because often there's so much excitement about getting to talk. And then, we never get to the signing table. So we're all gonna just be very well behaved and sit tight. And John, I think, is gonna pop out from behind the screen here and do some kind of magical transport in some speculative fashion to move our writer over to the purchase desk. So let's just say one more thank you for this evening, and then we'll